In the United States, police are allowed to lie to suspects.
Yeah, this is really important for people to understand how skewed the system is.
Yes.
Your partner is in the other room, and he just said, you did it. But they make it up.
Critical component to mind control. Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid. Interested in this subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. I have to tell you all, I'm so excited about my next guest. I've been waiting for months to do this interview with Dr. Brian L. Cutler, who is a PhD, a forensic expert, an expert in my field of particular interest, social psychology and forensics. And for those of you who are my regulars, you know that I got involved with this forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School because I realized the law is out of date with understanding how the mind works and how much social influence can influence people to do and believe things that are not common sense or normal. And I was encouraged to go to Fielding to do my doctoral work. And we're now talking to the program director of Fielding Graduate University. And I'm honored to have you on, Dr. Cutler. I'm just going to say a few more laudatory things before we jump in so my listeners can know more about you.
Don't stop on my account.
I love your humor, too. So you earned your doctorate in social psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison back in 1987. You've held research grants from the National Science Foundation, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. You've had publications. I'm going to ask you to hold up a couple that you have handy. Why don't you hold up, and its first one is called Mistaken Identification, the Eyewitness Psychology and the Law that you did. And another one you're going to hold up is the APA Handbook of Forensic Psychology on Volume 2, Criminal Investigation, Adjudication, and Sentencing Outcomes. Awesome. Thank you. You've been the editor or author of the APA Handbook, that's what we just said, of Forensic Psychology, the Encyclopedia of Psychology and the Law, Reform of Eyewitness Identification Procedures, Conviction of the Innocent, Lessons from the Psychological Research, and 5 other books. You're a distinguished member of the American Psychology Law Society, a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and you've been an expert witness and consultant on topics of eyewitness identification, interrogations, including police interrogations, and false confessions in criminal and civil cases in the U.S. and Canada. And with that, my listeners, welcome Dr. Brian Cutler to the Influence Continuum.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, and I'm delighted to be here, and I greatly appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to address your audience.
Great. And so I've been fighting the uphill battle, may I call you Brian now? Or
Absolutely.
Brian. I've been fighting this upward battle for 49 years since leaving the Moonies, where people are like, what was wrong with you that you got into this cult? You know, what were you looking for? Did you have a weak father, or did you lack smarts or whatever? And when I got deprogrammed, I wanted to understand social psychology and how, brainwashing in China and all of that. So I've been trying to explain to people, intelligent, educated people under the right social psychological conditions can be made to believe false things and etc. So when you said, amongst my work, I do police interrogations, I went, I've never had a guest talking about police interrogations. So if you're willing, and feel free to give any more background that you like, as you are a professor, but tell us about your research and your findings with police interrogations.
Sure. And since we're not real rushed for time, I'm going to take a step backwards and talk about social psychology, which is my training.
Great.
And go back to your original point that when learning somebody has been indoctrinated by a cult, they might look to you and say, "What's wrong with you? What is it about you that led to this situation?" And social psychology is the study of how people think, feel, and behave in social situations. Social psych is one of the pillars of psychology, according to the American Psychological Association. It's one of the historic fields, and it's still very active to this day. It's taught in the vast majority of undergraduate psychology programs, so it's very, very important part of the field of psychology. And we learn a couple of lessons that are relevant. First, when understanding the behavior of other people, we tend to look to their personality, their disposition. What is it about them? Somebody walks into a room late. It's like, what's wrong with them that they can't get there on time? Are they unreliable? Are they disorganized? When it comes to our own behavior, we look to the situation to explain what happened. Oh, why was I late? I was late because there was traffic. I was late because I ran into somebody in the lobby and I couldn't ignore them. I had to speak with them. It took some time. So that is called the actor-observer bias and attribution. We explain other people's behaviors by their individual characteristics and our own behavior on the basis of situations. Not always, but that's general trends. Well, the truth is that that other people are just as impacted by their situations as we are. So that's a bias that we have.
Right.
Social psychology has, for decades, 100 years almost, has examined how people are influenced by situational forces external to themselves. And, the short answer is a great deal. We are human. We are social beings.
Yes.
We live with other people. We look to others for information, for support, for an understanding of how to behave, what to think, what to believe, and we are very influenceable. Right. That is what social psychology has studied forever and continues to study. So, that with the background, I'm going to come back to your question about police interrogations.
Great. Can I just say, sir, that I've been sharing with my audience the fundamental attribution error, which is the principle of social psychology. But what you just described, I have not said before. This distinction of when we look at others, it's different than the way we talk to ourselves and analyze. So I just wanted to highlight that this is a very important, unique insight into the human experience.
Yes, they both come from a classic field of social psychology, attribution theory, which goes back to the 1950s.
And Leon Festinger.
Long time. And Fritz Heider and others. Classic area of social psychology. Police interrogations. I do a lot of work in the area of wrongful convictions. This is my area of social justice in which I practice.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major causes or precursors to wrongful conviction is false confession.
Mm-hmm.
Why would somebody falsely confess to a crime they didn't commit? If you think about it, would you do it? Of course not. I wouldn't even confess to a crime that I did commit. But it's very difficult to understand why an individual would falsely confess until you start examining the conditions, those social influence factors that led to them to false confess. There are multiple reasons for that, multiple explanations for false confession, but the most common one is that suspects were coerced, or at least persuaded into falsely confessing. So if you take the time to understand what happens to a suspect from the time they are arrested to the time they are interrogated,
Mm-hmm.
what happens during interrogation, which is not common sense, unless you're a police officer trained in interrogation.
Mm-hmm.
It at least becomes more fathomable
Mm-hmm.
that people would falsely confess. So it can be summarized as a two-step process. And I could give as much information as you want on how interrogation works, but it boils down to this. The investigator, through the use of interrogation tactics and time and pressure, convinces you that you have no chance of convincing the interrogator, or perhaps anyone else, like a prosecutor or a judge, that you didn't commit this crime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And let's assume you didn't commit this crime.
Right.
So you have no chance of convincing me, Stephen, that you didn't you didn't commit this crime. That's the first step. The second step is to convince you that things will go easier for you if you confess than if you maintain your innocence and be found guilty, which you surely will.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the combination of those two things. You can't convince me or the DA or the judge or the jury that you're innocent, and you will get better treatment by the criminal justice system for confessing instead of maintaining your innocence. Now, the irrational, falsely confessing, starts to sound rational.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind that all this is happening when you are isolated.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have your lawyer. You don't have your parents. You don't have your partner. You don't have your friends with you. You don't have your cell phone with you. You may have one or more you have at least one. There could be more officers.
Right.
So you're really isolated. You might have been there a long time and getting worn down. You might be motivated to end this. And all the while, the interrogators may be doing things like confronting you with evidence of your guilt. This may be real evidence. This may be completely false evidence. This may be exaggerated evidence. I know you have an international audience. In the United States, police are allowed to lie to suspects.
Yeah, this is really important for people to understand how skewed the system is.
Yes.
Your partner is in the other room and he just said, you did it. But they make it up.
We have you on videotape. We have your fingerprints, or these items we took from the scene have been sent to the lab, and they're going to point to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of one thing they do. But when my colleagues and I analyze interrogations, we look at about 38 different tactics. So there's a lot of things that are done. Those are just a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you another example that's common and important. It's called minimization.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea is to do things like offer up rationales and excuses for why you committed this crime. Stephen, I know you're not a bad person. I don't even think you planned this out. I think you were kind of desperate. You're out of a job. You need to support your family. There was an opportunity. You suddenly just, I don't know what came over you, but it was an impulsive act. I'm sure you're sorry for it. It was a mistake. So to offer up justifications that don't tell you you'll be treated more leniently for confessing, but make you think that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or they might say, it's not like you killed somebody, Stephen. Or they might say, this guy deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
So rationales, excuses that minimize the acts, and that has the effect of leading you to believe that if you agree to one of these minimized versions of the crime, that you will be treated more leniently. So it's the course of this interaction, this social interaction between you and interrogator, the behavior, verbal behavior, sometimes verbal behavior of the interrogator that's influencing you, influencing your thoughts, emotions, and behavior to come to what to anyone else seems irrational, but to you starts to sound rational, that I'm just better off confessing and hoping for a lenient treatment, or at the very least to end this really obnoxious situation.
Right. So I'm curious, what's the longest amount of time a person that you've evaluated was being interrogated in a 24-hour period?
Just to be clear, I don't evaluate people. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I evaluate situations.
Right.
You're already selling this short by saying in a 24-hour period, because in known cases of wrongful conviction, some portion of them go to 30 hours, 36 hours. It's not continuous questioning. It's a period of question, leave somebody alone for a while, questioning for a few more hours, leave somebody alone, let another officer take over because the investigator's worn out. The suspect may be too, but we need a fresh investigator in here. And then that could be just one interrogation. Some people are interrogated multiple times over the course of days or weeks or months. So people become very worn down. In psychological terms, their ability to self-regulate becomes depleted. Self-regulation is the ability to control your own thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And you could think of self-regulation like an energy source or a muscle. When you wake up and you've slept and you're fed, you're ready for the day. You can withstand anything. But as the day wears on, you get tired, you get hungry, that's when you're more likely to lash out or eat something that you'll later regret. Because, you know, your self-regulation becomes depleting.
Right.
Just arguing
Right.
depletes self-regulation. So the social forces lead to these psychological processes, and magnify the influence of social influence.
And I seem to remember reading an article, maybe it was one that you wrote or a chapter about, was it California that would videotape interrogations and then you could forensically evaluate the actual interrogations and the techniques?
With increasing frequency, more and more states are recording interrogations.
Mm-hmm.
Canada interrogations and many witness interviews are recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So it's become a common practice. It has become required in many states.
Mm-hmm.
And where my research fits in is that although psychologists, lawyers, advocates have been arguing for recording interrogations for a long time, and now successfully,
mm-hmm.
nobody's really talked about how to evaluate these recordings. You know, it's not like you can, you know, everybody will watch it and reach the same conclusion. You ever talk about watching a movie with somebody and you come away with completely different messages?
Right.
So we have, my colleagues and I have taken a psychological scientific approach using what's called psychometrics, the science of psychological measurement, to develop a methodology for analyzing coerciveness and interrogations. I know that's a mouthful. We're not analyzing whether confessions are true or false. We're analyzing the level of coerciveness that occurs.
And when you say coerciveness, it's not them hitting the person, it's the emotional, psychological coercion that you're speaking about?
We like to think that the days of physical torture ended in the 1930s. And for the most part, that has, with some exceptions. Those exceptions include the John Burge era in the 1980s and 90s in Chicago. The vast majority of cases in which I am involved are psychological coercion. Since the 1930s, when physical means of interrogation was basically outlawed, trainers of interrogation have been developing psychological methods of interrogation very successfully. And here I should preface this by saying I'm talking about U.S. criminal case interrogations, not what happens in international security interrogations. That's really a different ballgame. So I'm talking about U.S. criminal cases.
On citizens.
Yeah. So the most effective interrogations are not bullying. That does happen quite a bit.
Right.
But the most effective ones are a more gentle and compelling form of coercion. I liken this, and others have likened this to the con game, the confidence game. And think about your own unfortunate experience. You didn't become a member of a cult because you were bullied into it.
Right.
You were convinced by credible sources at the time.
Well, it was women that started it, Brian, to be completely honest, flirting with me and lying to me. They're not part of a group. They're not part of a religion. We're just students.
Well, so I shouldn't pretend to know what happened in your situation, but I would still guess that it wasn't the result of bullying. It
Correct.
was other uh, uh, methods of influence that drew you in cooperatively.
Right.
That's what happens in the con game. That's why people end up losing
Right.
substantial sums of money because they become convinced that somebody's
Right.
helping you, and that's what happens. The best interrogations that I've seen do just that.
Yep. I was referred to a book called The Interrogator by a former CIA agent back, I think, in the late 70s after I exited. It was about a German, the most successful German Nazi interrogator. And that was exactly his technique, was warm, respectful, friendly, giving food, giving cigarettes, finding common ground that, that you love your children or whatever. And I've always kept that in mind. But if you don't mind cycling back to the psychometrics that you said you've identified in your forensic stuff, can you share a little bit more about some of these factors that you look at in addition to what you've already shared?
Sure. We have and I won't drone on about this because there's a lot of details that I'm probably not interested. But our work was, which was funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada when I was teaching at Ontario Tech University, involved developing a standardized instrument. And we started by putting together from various sources 200 different tactics that investigators could use in interrogation. We got them from training manuals, other people's research, legal cases. And through the process of item reduction and expert consultation, we brought it down to about 38, I believe it is. And there are different categories of tactics. So one category is evidence-based tactics, and those include things I mentioned earlier: presenting evidence, presenting false evidence, because that's a specific risk factor for false confession, baiting or bluffing about evidence. So that's one category. The minimization, as I described, is another category. There's another category called consequence-based tactics. And these are tactics that suggest harsher consequences for maintaining your innocence than for confessing. And there's several tactics under that category. There's another tactics that's called social and psychological manipulation. That is just as it sounds. Manipulate you in several ways by, for example, by appealing to your religion, and talking about the impact on the victim, and talking about how your family will see you. So there's a wide variety of tactics that we code for, and we see them. My colleague Dr. Jeffrey Kaplan, who I work closely with, he was the graduate student on the project and has published this instrument and other papers along with me, has analyzed more than 200 interrogations through consulting and for research. Be surprised how many of these are in the public domain on YouTube. And these are tactics we see regularly.
Well, I'd like to put a link to that publication in the blog that we do based on this interview, because I have a feeling as people are listening to you, they're like, I want to learn more. This is fascinating.
Sure.
So we've heard stories, especially back to the 80s, of the Satanic Panic and people claiming out of the blue, seemingly, that they were, their family was in a satanic cult and everybody in the city raped them as a child, even back to, 1 year of age or 2 years of age. Can you share anything about other than police interrogations, if we can shift the context for a second.
Sure. There's been a number of phenomena besides the cult experience, which you are better qualified to speak about than I. In the 1990s, I believe, there were a number of high-profile cases of children reporting that they were sexually abused, daycare cases, and the like. And one of the factors that comes up in those cases is the way they are interviewed.
Exactly.
So the forensic interviews of children. And in psychology, there are psychologists who focus on interviews of children. So, what comes out of this research is an understanding of how the way children are interviewed can result in false claims, exaggerated claims, and more importantly, standards for how to influence children. In the 1990s, there was, I would say, a great debate about repressed memories.
Right.
And this involved adults who, or young adults, or older adults, who uncovered traumatic memories of having been abused or sexually abused by friends or relatives, or even parents
or priests.
Yes, no doubt some of them were. But there were also false claims that come from these. And, one of the sources of false claims is the context in which these so-called repressed memories occur. They often occur in the course of therapy, where the therapist might have some influence over what's being reported, and that could be completely inadvertently.
It can be inadvertent, but it also could be the result of the therapist going to a workshop saying, use hypnosis to uncover the problem, and using suggestive interviewing that was putting ideas into people's heads that they later came to accept as real.
Yes, it could be. And if people are motivated to harm people in that way, that's one thing. But what I find really interesting is when these phenomena happen inadvertently, when the sources of influence have no intention of having these effects, no knowledge of it, and maintain that they didn't.
Right.
A great example of this also occurs in false confession cases. It's called contamination of the confession. This is where the investigator, often without realizing it, conveys details associated with the crime that only the guilty person would know. And the suspect, in the course of the innocent suspect, in the course of learning, in the course of the interrogation, learns these details, incorporates them, and repeats them in the form of a narrative, so that the innocent person appears very knowledgeable about how the crime occurred, and the confession appears very compelling. There's a Duke University law professor, Brandon Garrett, who's done number of studies of what we call DNA based exonerations, where DNA being the gold standard led to the exonerations. He analyzed their false confessions, and he found that very high percentages of them involved contamination. So the innocent suspects provided really compelling narratives about the crime. So they looked like guilty suspects.
Right. So just to be clear, my listeners, I believe it's called the Innocence Project, where people are convicted and they confess to crimes, and then they find out DNA evidence, that was ignored or that was, not properly analyzed, and it's clear someone else did the crime, but the person really believes they did the crime, and in a sense need to be like, hello, you know.
Well, some. I should say that most coerced false confessions, the innocent person knows they didn't commit the crime, but they confessed under duress from all the pressure. They'll say, "I was worn down. I wanted to end this horrible situation, this interrogation, or I came to believe." Because here's authority figures telling me in one way or another that it's in my best interest. I will be treated better. But some portion of those false confessors will create what we call either an internalized false confession or a persuaded false confession, where they either come to believe they committed the crime, or at least have enough doubts about their memories that they come to believe they could have committed the crime. Like they had a blackout, example, an alcohol-induced blackout, or they were split personality, and the evil version. The
DID.
Yeah, this happened in the interrogation of young man Michael Crow in the involving the death of his younger sister, and the investigators suggested to him that there was he's got another personality, and that this was the evil Michael Crow that did this and just tore him apart. The idea that he could have murdered his sister. There are other cases in the annals of the Innocence Project, which thank you for mentioning. If you go to innocenceproject.org, you can read a lot about these cases. So a small percentage of them, they come to believe that they actually committed the crime.
Right. And just to add a little cult frame, in cults like Scientology, where they believe in reincarnation, you may not have believed it before you got recruited and indoctrinated, but they have this model where they say, well, if you don't have superpowers now, let's go back and clear all of the traumas in your life, of your reactive mind and your bad engrams. And then when they get back to in utero, they go into past lives. And people are remembering that they murdered somebody, they were a Roman gladiator or whatever, but they walk around thinking they murdered somebody, in a past life as a Scientologist, and they feel badly about
it. As you talk about it, it may sound outlandish, but in reality, we naturally look to other people to understand reality, particularly in ambiguous situations. So, when you believe something and then multiple people around you, multiple people you trust, tell you something different, it makes you question yourself. And if you're a reasonable, rational person, you would consider the possibility that your belief is wrong, right? So if the only people you're surrounded with are people who have a belief, then it's totally normal that we would start to believe. We're not faced with any disconfirming information. Sometimes you have to go out of your way to find disconfirming information. May I come back to one thing you mentioned earlier, which I think is important?
Please do.
In false confession research, we do find that certain types of people are particularly vulnerable to social influence and vulnerable to false confession. And this includes both traits and states. So youth, individuals with developmental disabilities or intellectual disorders, individuals with mental illness are particularly vulnerable. We are more vulnerable when we're tired, hungry, and in pain. So these characteristics render us more vulnerable. But you don't have to be in these categories to be influenced or to be to falsely confess. It happens with quote unquote normal, healthy, intelligent adults who are rested and fed and comfortable, that we still are under the influence of people around us because we are human, and that is a characteristic of humans.
Yes. So I'll just say that in my work, a lot of what I do is psychoeducation with families to help them understand how their loved one got radicalized. And then when I'm talking with the individual, and I typically show them the Ash conformity study and the Milgram obedience study and the Zimbardo prison study. Any comments on those studies or others that you may be aware of that would shed light on how much we want to fit into a group? In the case of Ash, they show a line and different lines, and 2/3 wind up agreeing with the wrong answer, even though they can see with their own eyes.
I think those are really compelling examples, and they can be made more compelling by looking at the backstory of why they were done. So if you look at Ash, for example, Solomon Ash did this research in the 1950s. About 10, 15 years before that, there was a psychologist by the name of Muzaffar Sharif. And he and his wife, Carolyn Sharif, did some really interesting studies. One is called the Robber's Cave study of youth. And it was a study about intergroup relations. But he also did a study on norm formation and influence using what we call the autokinetic effect. This is a perceptual illusion that occurs involving being in a dark room with a light, and under certain conditions, it gives the appearance that the light is moving. So individuals in the study would estimate how much movement they see. And norms would form, and as you replace people, those norms persisted, and people would conform to those norms. Ash thought that was a function of how ambiguous the stimuli were. It was a perceptual illusion that if you give people concrete information, that you won't see that kind of conformity. And that's why he developed that study, which line is the same length as which line. Yet he found in 33% of the cases when what we call the Confederates in the research, the other people who were posing as being subjects in the research, gave a false answer, that 33% of the time, the naive real subjects conformed to a wrong answer, knowing that it was wrong. But succumbing to the pressure. Why did Milgram do the obedience study? Milgram was interested in the Holocaust experience. This was done shortly after the Holocaust.
Right.
And was interested in why Nazi prison guards would go along with committing atrocious acts on other human beings when they themselves might not have been atrocious human beings. They might have been relatively normal people. So he created this situation to show the power of the authority figure, how people modify their understanding of a situation on the basis of what they're presented with from authority in front of them. So it really those are classic, beautiful studies of people focusing on social influence.
Right. And my recollection is that Milgram was also responding to Adorno and others that were saying it's authoritarian personality types. And he was like, only the Germans would do this and not Americans. And he said, well, I'm not so sure about that part. And it was and the appeal was for science, and you made a commitment, and you were getting a little bit of money, but this phony shock machine where people were simulating, electrocuting somebody else, even though there was no electricity.
Really, really excellent addition to the discussion. And it comes back to what I mentioned earlier, is of attribution. Are they behaving that way because of the kind of people they are, or the situation they find themselves in? Well done.
Well, you taught me something, because I did not know about the earlier study that Ash was responding to. But the heroic resistor who would stand up to that other Confederates who were insisting a 3-inch line was a 2-inch line, even though it's clearly not. Those heroic resistors were cringing as they were giving the right answer. Like, it was painful to go against the group.
It's really interesting. Just on that same genre of studies, one of my former profs at Wisconsin, Vernon Allen, he and his graduate student were interested in the effect of a single other deviant on conformity. So they did basically the Ash study, but they had one other Confederate to the experiment give a non-conforming answer. So just the presence of one other person providing, in a sense, some level of support greatly diminished conformity. And that occurred even when the other person was only able to provide social support, not what we call informational support. So, for example, they gave the other wrong answer, or they couldn't see the lines. They didn't have their glasses, or they're just were visually not as capable. But just the mere presence of another person deviating empowers people to resist conformity. But when nobody deviates, the pressure is very strong.
So just to be clear, was the deviant agreeing with the correct answer, or they were also just giving the incorrect answer, but not the same one that everyone else was giving?
Well, I don't remember all the details, but I think there was a condition where they gave another wrong answer, but there was also a condition where he took off his thick glasses and he's rubbing his eyes and made it kind of clear he was not a good judge of these lines. So he was a low credibility deviant, but Just his presence empowered people to resist conformity.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So, there's so many other questions I want to ask you, but I guess because we have, about 10 minutes left, I would just love to ask you, as a social psychologist who was trained prior to the internet being developed, and now seeing how many people are on screens and smartphones, your feelings and thoughts about how we can be socially influenced remotely.
Well, I will mention at first that I'm the director of a very unusual set of programs at Fielding called media psychology. So we are well steeped in these issues, and we study them and teach them on a day-to-day basis. So if this is of interest to any of your listeners, check us out, Fielding Graduate University Media Psychology programs.
And I endorse Fielding. It was an incredible experience for me. I got my second master's on the way to getting the doctorate, but just brilliant professors are hired, and but there's a lot of encouragement to follow your passion, what your research interests are and such. Please share a few gems from the media psychology program for our listeners.
I'd love to come back to your question because it's a really interesting one.
Great.
In the research that we've been talking about, we're exposing people to beliefs that are different than theirs. That requires some outside intervention. Back in the day, before the internet, if you got the newspaper, the New York Times, whatever newspaper you got, the Boston Globe, you get exposed to all kinds of views. And you really have to go out of your way to get different kinds of views. Now, people are very selective of the views they obtain, and many people limit themselves to sources of information that confirm or support their beliefs. So if you look at the difference between CNN and Fox News, there's a world of difference, right? If you if you look at both websites or shows equally, maybe you'll get a sense between them what's going on. But do people do that? Probably not. People tend to choose their lanes, choose the types of messages they want to hear. And this also affects, who people socialize with, who they talk to. So we are much more careful about creating the world of information and beliefs and messages around us. So we're not necessarily getting the deviant opinions unless we're looking for it particularly.
Right. So you're referring to confirmation bias, that we tend to filter out information that confirms what we already believe. But then there's the other side, which is the algorithms. If there are bad actors that are wanting to nudge you to be more extreme on the left or more extreme on the right, or to give up hope or whatever, these emotional manipulations that are being done at scale with our personal data that is being crafted, that is the new world that we're now living in.
This is all true. But fundamentally, it comes down to where you start and what you pursue. So you could think about the Asch conformity experiment, where you are creating the experiment. You are limiting yourself to the sources of information around you. Some of them are sources that you directly choose, and some of them are foisted upon you through algorithms and the like, that you didn't look for these opinions, but here they are in your inbox. Or if you even use, social media sites at all, that's a choice that you make.
Yeah. Yeah. I've started using an app, Dr. Cutler, called Ground News. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's an aggregator. And what I like about it is it has a topical story, and then it says the percentage of progressive media and how they are framing the story, and the alternative media and the more so-called fact-based neutral reporting. So I like to hear, because I want to know what are MAGA people being told about a particular story, because that's part of what I do in my work. So it's so and there's so much bias, and there's so much push to emotional manipulation, as opposed to that analytical part of ourself that requires more effort to go, what's behind this, and now we're living in the world of AI and deep fakes, where people are saying things and the image is like the person, and it's completely made up, and people are getting tricked.
Yes, and I wasn't aware of Ground News, so I wrote it down. It sounds very interesting.
It's ground.news. It's an aggregator, but what I like about it, like I said, is it tells you the story, and then it gives you the percentage of the types of media along a spectrum. There's also a chart that I like by Ad Fontes that shows different levels of bias, and like names sources and identifies them more as straight and narrow, evidence-based reporting, and more conspiratorial, and etc. And again, it's just important, I think, for my listeners to keep in mind, rather than, if you know confirmation bias, don't just read stuff that you already agree with, but look at the other side, look at other perspectives, talk to people who have different views, and hear what are they basing their reactions off of. But in the end, I think you'll agree with me, this human species has been so successful based on trust and cooperation, not on fear and hatred and disgust.
Well, I mean that's could be another couple-hour discussion, rather existential. But we know that as social animals, that we do rely on others to help understand our reality.
Yes.
And those others can vary greatly in how truthful, how helpful they are. And the other thing is that we're all so busy that we often don't have the time to scrutinize a piece of news. So we take mental shortcuts, right?
Yes.
And that's when we are most biasable, when we're taking the mental shortcuts to say, okay, this is a credible person, I'll believe what they say. When I go to the doctor and the doctor says, take this, I don't have time to research everything behind it.
Right.
I believe this person. I take it.
Right. And Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow,
exactly,
the Nobel Prize winning book in behavioral economics, I think it was the category, just showed us that we're mostly working off of unconscious heuristics, some of which are from our childhood that have nothing to do with reality as an adult. And so we get triggered and we start behaving like a child when we're not a child, and we should be using our developments, our higher powers and such.
Right.
I'm so grateful that you made this time, Dr. Cutler. Last words, any other than check out Fielding Graduate University if you're interested in advancing yourself professionally. And it's clinical, it's social psychology. I got my degree in organizational development and development and change. So there's many different programs at Fielding, but last words are for you.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. In addition to, plugging our own program, our own university, let me plug the fields: social psychology, clinical psychology in general. Is such a fascinating field. Whether you pursue it at Fielding or anywhere else, I've been in this field for more than 40 years, and it continues to fascinate me and bring me great gratification. If you are looking for a career that will always keep you interested, this is one.
Yeah, and it gets you to know yourself better and understand the people in your world and around the world as well better. And thank you again.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed speaking with you.
Yes, and if you're listening to this podcast and you left an authoritarian group or were born in one, I strongly recommend learn about social psychology. It was one of the most important things in my recovery back when I exited almost 50 years ago, was learning about Chinese communist brainwashing and all the techniques that were being used to get people to conform. And so, let's grow and learn and be open to changing our minds. Thank you, Dr. Cutler.
My pleasure.